Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field.
Hey, have you ever been faced with the challenge of sourcing, installing, and programming a used control module in a vehicle? I know a lot of us have. It seems to be happening more and more often today with the volume of control modules on vehicles, the cost of some new ones, or even the availability of new control modules. In some cases, used may be the only option. So what do you do here? I strongly recommend checking out SJ Auto Solutions and Tommy Oliva. Tommy offers a cloning service for used control modules to make these things plug and play for the vehicle that you're working on. In a lot of cases, he is also able to source the control modules if you're unable to locate one for the vehicle that you're working on. But once you get connected with Tommy, he's going to offer fantastic support from start to finish to make sure that that control module is going to work in your application. He's also got tech support that he offers through his website, along with some free resources there as well on information about used control module programming. So make sure to check out SJ Auto Solutions. I can't recommend that enough. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I will be your host once again for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Today on the show, it's just me. I'm going to be going over a case study on a 2012 Infiniti QX56. This one I thought was interesting because of the way the problem presented itself. And it's a situation where, in my opinion, it would be tough to come to the conclusion that the thing that was the problem, the actual problem, and we'll get to what that is, was preventing keys from being registered to the vehicle, unless you knew that that's exactly how this system operated. And it's not abundantly clear to me. I mean, it wasn't in the moment, and it's still not when I went through service information, even though there are some clues, but it doesn't come out and tell you that, hey, if X thing is broken, you cannot register keys. That's not abundantly clear in the service information, in the scan tool when you're trying to program keys. And I mean, it's not intuitive. Now, there could be an argument made, and that all depends on your experience with these vehicles, right? Again, you may know, I might go through this problem and you might know right away, like, oh, I need to check for this, because if this isn't working, you can't register keys. Anyways, we'll get to that. I want to walk you through the steps, bring you along in this diagnostic and how we got to the conclusion. But again, this is a 2012 Infiniti QX56. We were originally called out to this to program a used body control module. You can find this behind the instrument cluster. You can do used on this year. Once you hit about the 2014 mark of Nissan Infiniti stuff, used is a little bit more questionable, if doable at all. You may have to get into some EEPROM work in that case, again, if it can be done at all. But this year range, 2012, you can do a used one, and it's fairly straightforward. As long as you get the correct BCM for that application, and if you get the exact correct one, really all you have to do is register keys. There is a configuration setup for body control modules that you can do through Consult, and so if you got one that was configured a little bit differently, you would have to change that. But again, if you get it out of the correct vehicle with the correct vehicle options, all you have to do is register the keys. It's essentially doing an all keys lost on the control module, and you can do that with aftermarket tooling. So really not that bad to program these things, and we've done plenty of Nissan Infiniti BCMs that fall under that same category. And there's various tools that you can use to perform this. The Autel is our tool of choice on the immobilizer side, the IM series, whether that be an IM 508 or 608. It just makes it really simple, holds your hand, and is pretty effective on these. I should note this is a push-button start vehicle, which a lot of Nissan Infinitis are. They have that oval-style key, which they used for over a decade on the Nissan push-button start applications. And the one, I don't know if you call it frustrating, part of Nissan Infiniti Smart Keys is, although that key looks identical for, like I say, a decade plus of vehicles from, I don't know, 2007 or 8 all the way up to 18, it physically looks the same, but internally there's probably just as many variations of that key as there are cars, like models within that decade of vehicles. We stock Nissan Infiniti keys, a lot of them, and it just got to be ridiculous because you needed a different key for almost every single model. So we've kind of pivoted to ordering keys as we need them. Anyways, this is a push-button start with the oval-style key. It does not have a slot. Some of the earlier versions of the push-button, you would actually put the key into a slot, particularly for the programming, but it was also the backup in case the battery in the key died. This is not the turn knob style. Those are the older ones. Those ones are actually pretty frustrating sometimes to do the key programming in. This is just a regular proximity push-button start vehicle. And again, we're just called in to program and use BCM. That was the original call. So we show up and we attempt to do that, which again is essentially an all keys lost through the immobilizer side of the auto. We can't do it. It fails out every time. And actually, the auto makes you think that the process was successful. I'll go through some of the details of the actual process here in a little bit, but you go through the motions and it essentially forces the ignition awake, and it has you hold the key up to the button, and the autel says key programming successful. Would you like to do the next one? Okay, sure. They only had one key for this. Wouldn't work. After the fact of the key programming, and although it seems to be successful on the tool, the dash in the vehicle tell you otherwise. The security light's still on, and that's a big clue. We'll talk about that. But also the vehicle doesn't start. Even though it allows ignition wake up for a period of time after this attempted key programming, you can't start the vehicle. And if you look at the amount of keys programmed, it says 0. Now, this is one thing that we have run into before on used BCMs or BCM replacement in general on Infiniti models. I'm sure it's true of Nissan as well, although I haven't actually run into it on a Nissan. I'm sure there are some models out there. Like I mentioned with the difference in keys on these, like there's different smart keys even though they look the same. Some of them lock to a body control module. And we recently had a couple different Infinitis where that was the case. Like it was a sedan of some sort. I don't remember the exact model, but they replaced the BCM because it had water contamination from a sunroof leaking. So they put a BCM in there, and we were unable to learn the existing keys, which worked with the old BCM. We could not learn them to the BCM that they were installing. We had to get new ones. Now, how do you know this if this is the case? You can use a tool like the Key Tool Max or the KM100 from Autel. You can read the chip in the key, and it will actually tell you if it's locked or unlocked. Now, there might not be anything when you read that chip, and in that case, that key can probably be reused on any BCM. And there are Nissan Infinitis where that's the case. They don't lock, but there are, and this is one of them, where if you scan that key, it will either say locked or unlocked. Now, there are some keys where you can actually unlock the key using some aftermarket tooling. I usually don't mess around with that too much, mainly because we sell keys. And so if there's a situation like that, we'll just say, hey man, you need some new keys here. Do you want us to supply them? So whether that key could have actually been unlocked, I don't know. But we told him, hey, this key is locked. Anyways, Steve was the one doing it. He called me and said, hey, this used BCM isn't working. I was like, hey, check the key. He checks the key. It says locked. Okay, that's probably why this isn't working. And we had just run into this on another Infiniti. So we told him, like, hey, do you want us to get you some keys and then we'll come back and do it? They said, yeah. So we get a couple keys. They're OEM refurbs, and you can check them with the Key Tool Max. They say unlocked. That's what we're shooting for. Go back, try to do the programming of the keys, exact same thing, right? So these ones unlocked do the same thing. We go through this key process to program the keys with the Autel, and although it shows successful on the tool, which the tool is really just walking you through the steps, the security light on the dash never goes out, and it never allows us to start the vehicle. We do a few checks. Steve was back out on this one, and it still did not work. So at this point, we told him, hey, we think the best course of action here would be an actual diagnostic that we would perform in order to tell you what's wrong here. We feel like there's something more going on. Maybe it was misdiagnosed, right? Maybe it didn't need a BCM. Maybe there's something else going on. Maybe this BCM that they put in is the incorrect application. But basically where we were that day, we didn't have time to dive into it. So we were going to get authorization from them for a diag, and then we'll come back. So it'll be our third trip back to the vehicle, but that's what we feel is the next best step in order to determine where to go. So we do that. They okay it, say, sure. Yeah. This is when I came in. Personally, I came to the vehicle to do the diagnostic to see what's going on. Now, before I started, I did ask, I was like, what's the story on this? What have you guys done? What did it come in for? Why did you put a BCM in it, right? I want to know that stuff. And it's really important that we ask those questions on every vehicle to try to get the whole picture. Has anything else been replaced? Why did you attempt doing this? What was the original status of the vehicle when it came in? So they told us this vehicle had been sitting for several months. Battery was dead. Customer tried to jumpstart it, was unable to get it started, got it towed into them, and then that's where they got it. So sitting vehicle with a dead battery, then came in and they were unable to start this vehicle. The shop determined that the BCM was what was at fault, causing this to no start. So they got this vehicle and they actually did a few different things to it in order to try to get it started. Now, they didn't have like a pre-scan on this thing for me, but they said they removed an aftermarket alarm system, which they had laying on the passenger seat, which was uninstalled. They took all the wiring out. That was one of the things that they did. They installed a used IPDM, which is like the smart fuse box, underneath the hood, and the used one was still installed when I got there. And then they also did the used BCM. That was their attempts to get this started, the parts that they felt were involved with starting the vehicle, which they are. The BCM is definitely involved. The IPDM is in control of the starter and a lot of other relays. That's definitely involved. And yeah, aftermarket alarm systems can cause some issues with starting, for sure. But none of those changed the issue, although I think we were in a worse spot now than when we started with it, when it originally came in. I think the ultimate problem would have been easier to identify had we started with square one. None of the stuff had been replaced or attempted to be programmed. That got us into a worse spot. But here's what I'm talking about it, right? A lot of people that listen to this maybe are mobile technicians, do a lot of diagnostics in shops, or maybe you even just want to go into that world of mobile diagnostics or just programming, right? I say this a lot, that diagnostics, like if you're going to program vehicles, right? You just say, I'm a mobile programmer, or even a locksmith, right? I'm going to be an automotive locksmith. I'm going to program and cut keys. I don't even want to do diagnostics, which, hey, I don't blame you. It's a very challenging thing to tackle. Unfortunately, you're going to have to deal with these situations where you almost have to diagnose something to get through it. Otherwise, you're just going to have to walk away, right? If my only ability at this vehicle was to program keys, and that was kind of where my ability stopped, I would have had to walk away from this one. I would not have been able to program these keys, no matter what tool I used, had I not been able to diagnose and figure out exactly why this is happening and what's wrong with the vehicle. So the other thing is if you're doing mobile programming, you're going to automotive repair shops, a lot of the time, the customer, the shop, has already tried to diagnose or repair the vehicle with various components. This is a prime example. And so the situation can be made worse or more complex after we've added in some problems. And that's my thought here. It's like, okay, we've got 2 used modules plus maybe an original problem. What I want to do with this vehicle here is kind of start with square one. I'm going to reinstall the original IPDM, and luckily they had all this stuff. I'll leave the aftermarket alarm system out of there. I usually suggest taking remote starts and alarm systems out of the vehicles anyways, so that's good. That's out. But I'm going to put in the original IPDM and original BCM back in the vehicle. Let's reinstall those, start from square one, see where we're at here, and try to just get it back to the original problem. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite that because the key programming had been attempted with both body control modules. And I'll explain how I know that. So I don't know, the shop must have had some tool that they attempted to do key programming with at some point. But when I put everything back to square one, when I try to key up the vehicle, it doesn't key up. I get a little red security indicator on the dash, meaning that, hey, it sees me pressing the button, but it won't turn on the dash. Okay, so I'm going to use my Autel, and I'm going to try to assess what's going on with the vehicle best I can. I have a feeling it has something to do with the key, the immobilizer, but let's get connected to it and see what information that I can get out of the vehicle. I really do like the Autel IM series, not only for key programming, but you can also use it to assess what's going on in the immobilizer system, and even like what modules are involved with the immobilizer on this particular vehicle. Maybe you're not super familiar with the model. You can go into the immobilizer side of these tools, and you can click on a tab that says Immobilizer System Scan. And I find this to be really helpful in a number of situations. Again, not only key programming, immobilizer module programming, but just assessment of the immobilizer system, right? Is this vehicle immobilized, right? Is it happy with the key that I'm using, right? Do the VIN numbers match on the modules in question? Does it see a key at all? Are there keys programmed, right? All of this can be shown to you in kind of a neat little package. Now, it's probably not all encompassing. There's probably situations where you may have to do a little bit more digging, but it gives you kind of an overall picture of the immobilizer system of the vehicle. Because what it's going to do is it's going to build you a mini topology on the left side of the screen of all of the modules involved with the immobilization of the vehicle. And then on the right side, it's going to break it down for you. And this will be different depending on the vehicle that you're scanning, but it's going to show you the modules involved, the VIN numbers that apply to said modules. You can click on them and actually read the codes, but it'll show you how many codes are in there. It'll show you the amount of keys that are programmed to whatever module holds the key data. And there's other various lines that'll show you of data, but it's all pertaining to the immobilizer system of the vehicle. Again, really good snapshot of what's going on. So I'm going to do this on this one just to kind of see where I'm at with the original BCM. I go through there, it reads the vehicle, and it shows me that there are 0 keys programmed to this vehicle right now. Now, also, I do note that where it says the VIN number, it's blank, or I think it said NA, which I didn't know if it would normally show me a VIN here, if it was supposed to show me a VIN here, but it didn't read anything out. And I also did have to build the vehicle manually when I went in with the scan tool, which at the time I didn't think a lot of. Looking back on it, it might have been a clue. This episode is brought to you by L1 Automotive Training and Keith Perkins. If you're looking for education on module programming, J2534, EEPROM work, key and immobilizer, electrical diagnostics, or drivability diagnostics, Keith has a website, l1training.com, that's got over 60 hours of training videos on all those subjects and more. When I first started out doing mobile, I utilized Keith's videos on module programming in J2534 in order to get my head wrapped around what I would need for the tooling, the computers, the software setups, what kind of obstacles I would be up against when I'm out there programming modules on cars. And it was a huge benefit to me. And I continue to use the training videos that he has on his website. So I strongly recommend checking out l1training.com. The link is in the show notes. So anyways, with 0 keys programmed, I know the first thing that I need to do before I go anywhere with this is get a key program to this, which we've already attempted to do. but not with the original BCM. We did it with the used one. Now, I mentioned earlier that I think the shop must have had tried to do some key programming because someone erased the keys from this BCM, I would assume. When you attempt to do key programming on these, it erases all of the keys as the first step. And then it'll do that regardless if there's a problem or not. And then if you're attempting to add keys in and it's not able to for whatever reason, maybe your key's locked, maybe you don't have the right key, maybe there's another problem on the vehicle, well, then it stays at 0. You don't get to go backwards once you erase those keys. And it appears to me, at least at face value here, that someone attempted to program keys, couldn't complete the process. Now we have 0 keys. So it would also make sense as to why I'm pressing the start button with the key and it's just blinking the security light at me. Okay, well, let's attempt programming a key in to this original BCM and see what happens. So I try that, and you can do this with the Autel on the immobilizer side. Walks you through the steps, very simple. It forces the ignition awake at this time in order to do some key programming, and it'll prompt you as to what to do with the key and when to press the start button. And it will make it seem like it's adding keys. Now, I mentioned before, the tool in this case for this model, it'll just say, key programming successful. Would you like to do the next one? Sure. And you could do this with as many keys as you want. So I tried this with both the original key to the car and the 2 new keys that we had supplied the shop as well. And although the Autel says programming successful, with these Nissans and Infinitis, if I'm key programming, I'm watching the security indicator on the cluster. Now, there's some various specific things that this indicator will do depending on the model that you're on, but the general overarching thing that you're looking for when you're doing these is that light should go out during the key programming at some point. It might blink a certain amount of times, but it should go out. If it is on steady, something did not occur properly, right? Maybe you don't have the correct key. Maybe the key is locked. Maybe there's another issue with the car. But if that security light stays lit up, there's an issue, which was the case here. And I verified that by going back into the immobilizer system scan, and it showed me 0 keys programmed afterwards. So I tried this with the original BCM. I tried it with all the keys. Again, original key, which says locked, but it should be locked to the original BCM. Okay, maybe that won't work. I don't know for sure. So my new keys, though, those should work. Now, those are OEM refurbs, but here's what I'm thinking. I'm like, are all of these keys wrong? Right? Like, is there something up with the original key and then the keys that we got? Is there something, wrong with them? I looked at the chip ID. The style of chip was the same between the original and new ones. I verified that the ones we ordered, okay, these should be for this vehicle. And not to say that we haven't had issues with, new keys before. That'll happen, but it's weird that none of them seem to work. The other thing is I use the Key Tool Max to scan these keys before and after, and the new keys never change status from lock to unlock. So it's like the BCM's not taking these keys at all. Now, it's definitely identifying that the key is present, because during the process, one of the steps is it says to hit the start button and then to hold the head of the key with the logo up to the start button, and the car should see it, automatically respond, and turn on the ignition, which it does with all 3 keys. So it's seeing the chip. It's not like it's completely incorrect for the vehicle. It's identifying it. And after the programming, that never changed. It kept saying unlocked, unlocked, unlocked. It never changed. Now, the original one still says locked, but it's like the process isn't completing on this. So here's my thought. I was like, well, maybe they diagnosed the original BCM correctly. I've had some Nissan Infiniti BCMs where you can't program the key in. It just is not accepting them. Usually when I've done that before, I've run into some of them that when you try to read the PIN code, it's like all Fs, and you can't make it through any of the processes. Didn't seem to be the case on this one, but what I was thinking I was like, let me put in the used BCM that we got and just see, am I getting the exact same results, right? I'm trying to determine whether maybe their initial assessment of the BCM was correct, or do we have another problem? And the way I'm going to do that in somewhat of an efficient manner, because they have the BCM exposed for me here, is I'm just going to plug in the used one and see if I'm in the exact same boat. So I do that, and I do the immobilizer system scan, and it shows me 0 keys in this one as well. Not surprised. We attempted to program keys to it. It erases the keys, and we weren't able to add them in. I go through the process with all the keys, exact same scenario. Can't add the original key, not surprised, but I can't add the new keys. Same thing Steve experienced. Same thing as on the original BCM. Okay. So should I try a different tool? Do I have a key issue? Is there maybe a body control module issue with the original and we have the wrong one for the used one? I don't know. But here's my other question. Is there anything else that could prevent the BCM from learning a key? Okay. I want to try something here to get a bigger picture of the vehicle than I have so far. I want to see if I can scan the whole vehicle and see if there are any other codes for any other modules that are pointing me towards something that might be going on with this vehicle. Because I think that it's weird that 2 BCMs are doing the same thing. I think that it's weird that it's not even attempting to learn the keys, right? The keys aren't getting locked. It's just basically blocking me at that point. So I tried doing a scan of the vehicle on the diagnostic side, right? We've done the immobilizer side, which is only a select few modules, but I want the diagnostic side of the tool, get a whole picture of the whole vehicle. Now I do that with the key in the off position to start, and you're going to get limited modules at this point. Now, I should actually note something here. When you go through and attempt to program the keys for the BCM, after you're done, and even after it fails, didn't add any keys, you can still cycle the ignition and turn the car on until the BCM completely powers down and goes to sleep, and then it will be back to the state where you can't actually turn the ignition on. But for a short period of time, you can still cycle the ignition. It just won't start. It won't crank. So just something to note, not super important, but if you're doing it and you're like, oh, how come the key still works? Let the BCM power down. If you weren't able to actually program any keys, it'll go back to the state where you cannot turn it on. And that's the state that I'm in right now, actually, when I do my scan. And I just want to see what modules respond. I get the BCM, and again, you got to have your hazards or light switch on to make sure it's awake. I get the IPDM, I get the cluster, and I get a few other modules that don't seem super important to me, but nobody's got any codes. Nobody's got anything indicating an issue, which I thought was surprising, at least for the BCM. I was like, I figured there'd be some code in there, but there was nothing there. So then I asked myself, okay, well, what if I power up the vehicle, force the ignition awake, and then do a scan of the vehicle? And again, my goal here, my thought here before I start diving into specific components is there anything else in the vehicle I'm not thinking of that could be involved with this system that's preventing the keys from learning, right? The BCM is main player when it comes to the immobilizer, but the IPDM is involved, right? And they had swapped it out, but I have the original one back in. I did look for a steering column lock. This one does not have that. But again, maybe there's something else involved that I'm not thinking of, not aware of. Or maybe once the ignition's on, I'm thinking maybe I'll get some codes that are helpful to point me in the right direction. So here's how I do this. And this was key to figuring out the problem. So I definitely want to point this out as an important thing to try or to do. I use the immobilizer side of the Autel to go in and do key programming and force the ignition awake and then leave it in that state, right? So I turn the key on, and then you can exit the immobilizer portion. Like I was kind of pretending like I'm going to program a key, and then I'm like, okay, never mind, just kidding. And I back out, and I go into the diagnostic side of the tool, and then I do a full system scan of the vehicle, right? So even though I have 0 keys programmed to this vehicle, even though it's not going to start, it's in an immobilized state, through the immobilizer portion of the tool, I can force everything awake, and then I can do a scan on the vehicle to see what's everybody thinking right now. who's got issues, who's got problems, what codes exist with the ignition on. Even though I got no keys program, I know that's a problem, but what else is going on? What else is preventing me from programming a key potentially? And this is where I found where I needed to go. At this point, with the ignition on, I could not talk to the ECM, no communication. And there were several other modules that now have codes saying no communication to the ECM, engine control module. Like, okay, well, I got to follow that, right? Because it's not like the ignition is half on, it's on, and the check engine light was actually on the dash too, but I can't talk to it. And I verified, I tried a couple different scanners, can't talk to the ECM. I'm like, okay, here we go, we got to follow this. So ECM is up by the battery, left front corner. Connectors on Nissans for modules are kind of a pain, not only to get to, but to pin out and test. So usually what I do for a module that's not super easy to access is I'll check fuses first, just because that's easier and I can do it quick with a test light. So I look up what are the power fuses to the ECM. I'm starting to go through those and I find fuse 71 in the relay box, which is the right rear corner of the engine bay. And I think I said left front corner for the battery and ECM. That was incorrect. That's on the right front side. Battery, ECM's like right behind the battery. That's at the front of the engine bay on the right side. The relay / fuse box is on the back right corner. And when you pull the cover off of this and you look at the designations, fuse 71 doesn't say 71 there. You have to look at service information. So I use all data. I go to the search, I put in fuse, I look at fuse locations. It'll pop up a diagram for me. I can see, okay, that's fuse 71. Now, why does that matter? Well, I start with an actual wiring diagram to figure out what fuses supply power to the ECM. Fuse 71 is one of them. There's others, but that's one of them that supplies it. It's a 30 amp. But if you pull the cover off of this box and you look at where fuse 71 is, it doesn't have a number, which is super helpful, but that's the way Nissan wants to do things. It just says DIG on it, and it's a 30 amp. Well, it's blown. Popped. I take another one. I got fuses in my little pack out. I pop a 30 amp in there, immediately pops. No hesitation. Okay, here we go. We're definitely on the right track here. So I look at this fuse and it only supplies a couple things, the ECM being one of them. So I decide, okay, well, I'm going to unplug the ECM. So I unplug the 3 connectors one at a time, and I have my test light on the feed side, or I shouldn't say feed side, the load side of the fuse, right? The side of the fuse, I've taken the fuse out, and the side of the fuse that goes to the ECM, I have my test light on there, and I've powered up my test light, right? So I'm looking for it to light brightly, and it does, indicating I've got a pretty good path to ground there. And I unplug the connectors at the ECM one by one. The bottom connector of the ECM, which is where that power supply goes into, that kills it. Basically, my test light shuts off. I can put a fuse in there at that point. It doesn't blow. I do a quick check on the ECM. There is a short to ground internal in the ECM. Odds are what happened here, one of two things. The vehicle, if you remember back to why it was there, had been sitting for several months. The battery died. Customer attempted to jumpstart. They weren't able to. It got towed in. Very possible it got jumped backwards. The other thing that might have happened is the location of the ECM is right behind the battery, and the ECM has a metal casing. It's possible they could have touched the metal casing with a positive jumper cable. Possible. Who knows? I didn't see anything obvious, but either way, my guess is that's what's happened. Right, so right now we have a shorted ECM that is blowing this fuse and obviously not communicating properly with the vehicle. Okay, is that our problem? Is that why we can't register keys? And I believe it is. Now, I haven't gotten final confirmation on this vehicle yet. We're waiting for the shop to get an ECM, and you can do a used one on these. I guess they're quite expensive. The shop said a used ECM is like $600 for one of these things, which I thought was kind of wild, but sometimes manufacturers are proud of them. But anyways, what I got to, right, I found the problem, or I found a problem, like that needs to be dealt with, and then we can proceed with the key programming. But the body control module needs the engine control module online in order to program keys in. Now, nowhere in service information does it come out and tell you this. And nowhere in the scan tool does it come out and tell you this. It doesn't even give you an error. And again, I'm using aftermarket tooling here. I'm using the Autel. Would console be any different? I don't know. I've used console a handful of times on key stuff, and it seems to give you the exact same prompts as Autel. I'm sure there are some differences. Like maybe it would tell me, hey, your key programming failed, rather than the Autel just saying, yep, you're good. It worked. Cool. But would it have come out and said like, hey, the BCM can't communicate with the ECM. We're not allowing you to program keys. And also, like, what does the ECM have to do with keys specifically? I realize it's part of the immobilizer system, right? If you replace an ECM, you have to do some type of immobilizer programming to get it to work in that vehicle. And there's a little bit of the key, because I dug into service information after this to try to see if there was anything that like really stood out that this it should have been obvious to me to look for this, or in the future, you know, I might think like, okay, I can't program keys. I should look at the ECM for communication. It wasn't my first thought on this, but I'm asking myself, well, should it be on Nissan Infiniti stuff? Now, if you go through a couple things here, again, there are some clues that point to it, but I mean, experience is probably the best teacher in this case. The couple notes in service info that I found was that when you replace an ECM, the first step that it has you do for a new, it doesn't come out and say used in the service info, but for a new ECM, it says perform initialization of IVIS or NATS, Nissan Anti-Theft System, and registration of all NATS ignition key IDs. Okay, that's for engine control module replacement. So the key ID is obviously stored somewhere in the engine control module. And so when we're going to register keys, we're doing it in the body control module, but that body control module is obviously transferring that data to the engine control module for this vehicle anyways. I'm not saying it's true of all Nissan Infiniti stuff, but at least for this one, that's how this works. And if it can't talk to the BCM, your keys just don't get registered. And if you look at the description operation, you can see that the BCM does communicate with the ECM when you're just keying up a vehicle normally. And it's just, that's part of the process of the immobilizer system. So although there's some hints there, it doesn't come out and say that, hey, if your ECM's offline, you're not going to be able to program keys. But hey, we know that now. It's something that I'm going to consider on these. Now, what I find interesting, and I still have a question for, maybe somebody out there can answer, is when it says the key is locked, which again, you could read with the Key Tool Max, what is it actually locking to? Is it the body control module? Is it the engine control module? I have a feeling it's the body control. Like I mentioned, I've had some Infiniti vehicles before where we put in a body control module and we had to do new keys because the old ones were locked. And we didn't change the engine computer in that situation, but obviously the engine computer is involved. So, you know, there's some proprietary information there of exactly how this immobilizer system is working. But when you're getting into doing this stuff, those are the kind of questions you want to ask. It's something that I'm curious about, something that I want to know a little bit more about. Of course, it takes time and experimentation to figure out how that exact system works, but this is a situation where like we have this data now, and I'm sharing it with all of you, of course. So hopefully this helps you out in some situation, or if you're dealing with these types of vehicles. But again, experience can be the best teacher here of like, hey, this module has to be online if you want to register keys. And again, had the vehicle been assessed correctly right from the get-go, probably wouldn't have had anything to do with keys, right? It wasn't until the point where keys were attempted to be done with the failed ECM that now we're in a situation where we have two problems and we have to try to identify the original problem through another layer of complexity. And it probably would have been even worse had I started with the used IPDM in there as well. But those are the sort of challenges you run into if you're going to be doing mobile. It's a interesting world out there with all kinds of crazy problems. So hopefully you found that interesting. Hopefully it's helpful. But just want to thank everybody for listening to the show. Always appreciate it. Other than that, let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.
Yeah.